started? If that's okay?
Yeah, maybe we should.
Oh, my name is Miles Kaufman.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
That's it.
Wonderful.
Okay. So, there's a world beyond ours, a world that's far away, nearby, and invisible. And that's where God lives, where the dead live, the spirits and the saints, a world where everything has already happened and everything is known. That world talks, it has a language of its own, and I report what it says. The sacred mushroom takes me by the hand and brings me to the world where everything is known. Maria Sabina, a famous shaman in southern Mexico. So on May 7th, 2019, Denver was the first city in the United States to decriminalize psychedelic mushrooms. They stated that since around 22% of the American public have already used psychedelic mushrooms, decriminalization will further destigmatize the fungus and allow more research to be done on its medicinal properties, and also reduce the rates of mass incarceration due to drug laws. So mushrooms have been illegal since around the 1970s, and research into their mechanism as a medicine was only really picked back up in the late 1990s. So this could be a start of like a new wave of decriminalization, which eventually shifts towards legalization, as we're currently seeing with marijuana, which was a movement that also started in Denver, Colorado. So Dr. Albert Hoffman, the synthesizer of LSD, said, paraphrase, that like one might think that since we've like isolated the chemical compounds that like make mushrooms active, that they're no longer magic anymore. But he said that substances, this is a quote, which believe that which because of their effects on the mind, that Indians could believe that God dwelt in these mushrooms can now be synthetically produced in a chemist's retort. Their effects on the human mind is just as inexplicable and just as magical as the mushrooms themselves. And this holds true for other isolated and purified principles of other plants of the gods. So, since Albert Hoffman first synthesized LSD, biologists have been able to understand a lot more about the mechanism by which psychedelics operate. So, but their magic is like still somewhat unexplainable. So in this image you see two kind of artistic renderings of like brain connections. The first is like your brain connectivity just like as you go through your day-to-day life. And the second is the connections in your brain when you're under the influence of psychedelic mushrooms. So there's a neuroscientist named David Hutt who believes that depressive thinking is a result of like too much connection in the part of the brain associated with your sense of self. So he believes that by using psilocybin, which is the active component in mushrooms, that he can like change these brain connections and that the brain can be rewired to treat depression. And there might be some truth to this, because psilocybin is in the last stages of testing as an antidepressant for treatment-resistant depression. And it could be an FDA-approved treatment in about a year or two. A team at NYU who's kind of like doing clinical studies on psilocybin saw that 60 to 80% of their test subjects reported lower amounts of like depressive thinking 6.5 months after just a single dose of psilocybin. So, in Mexico, the ceremony around psychedelic mushrooms is like performed at night, and there's usually like a lot of chanting accompanying like the hallucinations. And a lot of people say that these hallucinations are kind of like kaleidoscopic, colorful images, and occasionally like sounds are also imagined. So these journeys with hallucinogens often result in these grand realizations and changes in perspective that remain with the person for months, which kind of is explained by like the way that like, the brain is rewired and like different parts of the brain are accessed when like under the influence of this drug. So most people, even those who are secular, conclude that there's something in the universe beyond what we can beyond what's like tactile after consuming magic mushrooms. And people interpret this beyond in a bunch of different ways, but most people somehow still come to this realization. And so this rewiring can be like really eye-opening. And realizations and behavioral shifts after consuming mushrooms are really, really common. But serious side effects can also occur, including like panic attacks, psychotic episodes, and really like terrifying night terrors. So overdoses can also result in death, and there's also a bunch of like other unpleasant side effects like nausea, vomiting, muscle weakness, lack of coordination, things that could be like not so great if you're out and about in public or like in a moving vehicle. So the consumption of magic mushrooms in the United States has been illegal for about 40 years, 50 years, but there are over 200 species of psychedelic mushrooms that have been used around the world for thousands of years. So our culture has interacted with this medicinal plant in a very negative way because of our negative connotations surrounding mind-altering substances and our like prejudices against them. But like slowly people have kind of been shifting away from that narrative and beginning to kind of incorporate them into mainstream culture. It'll be really interesting to see how we continue to interact with this drug as the situation progresses. And so my main goal of this presentation is to examine past examples of traditional medicine being incorporated into our culture and kind of like see how we can use that framework, that historical framework, and kind of apply it to like current situations like this one. So I'm going to start by giving you like some historical historical background, like some terms, figures that are going to pop up. Then I'm going to go through 5 different plants, kind of give you like the story, how they work biologically, things like that. And then at the end, we're going to draw some conclusions about all those situations and how we can apply them to like current situations like this one. So this is the first of the few definitions that I'm going to give you. So Western medicine is a system in which medical doctors and other healthcare professionals such as nurses, pharmacists, and therapists treat symptoms and diseases using drugs, radiation, or surgery. So this is the primary medical system found in Western countries. It's also the primary medical system kind of run or set up by any type of government, but they all follow this format with like varying degrees of effectiveness. So traditional medicine, on the other hand, refers to the knowledge, skills, and practices based on these theories, beliefs, and experiences indigenous to different cultures used in the maintenance of health and in the prevention, diagnosis, improvement, or treatment of physical and mental illnesses. So other names for traditional medicine include alternative and complementary medicine. And around 1/3 of the world doesn't have access to Western medicine and uses traditional medicines instead, according to the World Health Organization. So reasons for using this type of medicine can include poverty, living in a really remote location, or just living a traditional way of life where these types of medicines would just be your go-to. So in my research, I focus on plant-based medicines in the Peruvian Amazon, Papua New Guinea, and Polynesia. So I noticed that traditional medicine in this area was deeply connected to plants, and those who were providing medicinal care had like really deep connections to individual plants and just to nature in general, and a lot of respect for nature's ability to cure them. So illnesses in all 3 of these regions were also very different. So if I go to my doctor's office and I have a bacterial infection, they'll treat the bacterial infection with antibiotics, very much so like, this is the physiological thing that is affecting you and this is how we're going to cure it. But in these places, it's not just, like, illness isn't just a matter of the physical, but it's also a matter of like the spiritual and the mental and just an all-encompassing illness of like the body, mind, and soul as a whole. So illness is also viewed in a less clinical fashion around the world. So my IP is on ethnobotany, which is the study of how people of a particular culture and region make use of native plants. So later I'm going to be giving examples of specific plants and their cultural backgrounds. So like I mentioned earlier, mushrooms, as you may know, like aren't plants, they're fungi, but the way in which people interact with them culturally is almost the same. So they fall under the same umbrella of like living things that ethnobotanists also would consider like plant enough to like study. So they also fall within the scope of my project. So I study most of my plants through an ethnobotanical lens first, but the ethnobotanist kind of like studies like the anthropology, the culture, like kind of like more of like a sociology type approach, but I really wanted to get into like the biological mechanisms by which these plants were working. So I kind of just like added that on too, which like isn't like true ethnobotany, but it works. So above is a picture of Richard Ellen Schultes, who was considered the father of modern ethnobotany. So as we continue to talk about the morality of interacting with other cultures and their medicines, we should first take a look at his approach with like these interactions, which like his interactions did set the stage for future ethnobotanical studies. So he started out at Harvard and he traveled to southern Mexico to study magic mushrooms. And his research and understanding mushrooms also led to the synthesis of LSD. He worked really closely with Dr. Alfred Hoffman. And they even co-authored a book called Plants of the Gods. I highly recommend it. I quoted it earlier. So later in his life, he went back to Harvard to teach, and he continued doing field research. His work, mainly like his famous work, was really in South America and Native American reservations. He would immerse himself fully into the culture, live alongside Native people, and like study their medicinal practices that way. So there are testimonies from Native Americans who said that he was the first white person to come and treat them with respect, and he actually seemed genuinely interested in learning from them instead of about them. So he was doing his research in like the 1930s, 1940s, when most people at Harvard didn't really respect indigenous people and their knowledge. So his immersive method and respectful approach was really quite unique for the time. So that's one of the key reasons he was so successful. And his students who learned from him, like Wade Davis and other individuals, were also successful because they were able to use his approach and do really fascinating research as well. So Thomas Lovejoy, who was also another prominent biologist, said that Schultes was a true giant. No person has done more to understand and appreciate indigenous peoples and their knowledge. Ethnobotany is a stronger discipline with greater moral stature through his work and example. So just because Schultes was respectful in his approach doesn't mean that people after him always were, and doesn't mean that the people before him were either. As you might expect, there's a bunch of examples of like some really, really destructive interactions between Western culture and traditional medicine. So I'm about to give you 4 stories of cultural collisions that wound up being really negative for the indigenous people and also sometimes the Westerners as well. So this is a picture of a cocoa plant, which grows in the areas that are like colored in on the map of Peru. So it grows in the Andes Mountains, which is a mountain range that kind of comes up through here, and it just kind of grows up there. So in the early 1500s, the Spanish kind of arrived in South America, and they like burned towns, they killed people. Capitalism kind of drove them all over the place looking for ink and gold, which is what they were like really searching for. And they were really in uncharted territory, searching for like profit, and they often found themselves really helpless there. So they got all these diseases, and they had to really turn to local people for help because they didn't know what the heck to do. So with these new sources of information, the Spanish also discovered the coca leaf, which they turned into a new source of income. So up in the Andes Mountains, there are these people called the Quechua people. They were once the people of the Incan Empire, because that's not around. These are the people that are kind of like left over from that. And they've been chewing coca leaves for 8,000 years. So life in the Andes is really hard because you're so high up in the mountains, but coca leaves really do help mitigate a lot of the side effects of life at high altitudes. So in the mountains, it can get really, really cold, really suddenly, and there's also really low levels of oxygen in the air, which can cause low levels of oxygen in the blood. And that can lead to fatigue, difficulty breathing, and in really extreme cases, it can lead to altitude sickness and even death. So coca leaves, like I said, have been grown for nearly 8,000 years, making them the oldest domesticated plant in the region and one of the oldest domesticated plants in the world. So coca leaves hold a lot of cultural and religious importance, and they're staples of like many religious rituals in the area. So in the early days of the Incan Empire, coca leaves are really reserved for like the elite, like the kings, the like really rich people. But because there's a significant boost in energy one gets when like chewing on the leaf, those people were really inclined to give it to the common people because it meant that they would like work faster, work harder, be more productive. So nowadays, if you walk in the Cusco region, Cusco is the biggest city in the Andes Mountains, you'll see people like sitting there with bags of coca leaves chewing it because it's just like so ingrained in their daily life. They use it for energy and pain relief, kind of similarly to like how we would drink like coffee. So the active molecule in coca leaf is called cocaine. Some of you may have heard of it. So in this picture, you'll see this is an image of the 2 neurons communicating with each other. So basically how that works is these compounds called neurotransmitters get sent from one neuron to the other across this little gap. And then these little like things, they like, capture the compound, process it, and release it, and it kind of goes back into the cell that sent the signal in the first place. So what cocaine does is it blocks the thing that's going to take it back, that's going to like send it back into the transmitting neuron. So there's just like a bunch of extra neurotransmitters just like floating around. So this particular neurotransmitter is called dopamine, which is responsible for like happiness, euphoria. You've probably heard of it before. And so this means that like when cocaine's in your brain, there's just a huge excess of dopamine there too because it can't be reabsorbed. And this creates a really extreme sense of euphoria. And cocaine also causes blood vessels to constrict, and it inhibits a protein that's responsible for breaking down blood clots. So in high doses, the combination of these effects can lead to a lot of cardiovascular issues like heart attacks and strokes. So cocaine in its pure form has different effects than cocaine you get off of a coca leaf, just because there's so much more of it in its pure form. So the leaves provide really a lot of benefits for those living in high altitudes. So in a study done in the 1970s, it was found that coca leaves like reduce body temperature in your fingers and toes, which would then help you preserve your core body temperature, which is important in the mountains when it gets really cold. They also have been proven like effective in treating hypoxia, which is a condition where when your body doesn't have enough oxygen in its tissues, it'll start producing more red blood cells to like counteract that. But when you're at high altitudes, that actually worsens the symptoms of altitude sickness. And coca leaves have been found to inhibit this like biological response, which then decreases the effects of altitude sickness. So Spanish arrived and they tried to eradicate coca leaves, but they also noticed that there was a huge productivity boost when people were like chewing on them. So they were like, well, this is great, and they like let people continue to chew them. And they brought it back to Europe, to Spain, where people kind of took interest in it, and European scientists began to study the leaf. They were able to like then isolate cocaine, which is the active component, and they began to focus on producing pure cocaine. So people realized that it was highly addictive, that this euphoria, like people just like couldn't get enough of it, and they began to view cocaine really negatively. People were dying from it. It reduced people's effectiveness in like being productive members of society, and quickly it was banned in like pretty much all countries except Peru and Bolivia. So before pure cocaine was produced, these leaves were like grown for 8,000 years. They're a staple of Andean culture, but due to cocaine production, coca plants have literally been ripped out of the mountains just to like get rid of them, which like didn't work at all. But the abuse of cocaine has really like soiled this plant's reputation, and although the intentions of those who were studying the plant, they weren't malicious. Cocaine wasn't isolated with any like malice, any bad intention, but the situation really escalated to a point where ancient tradition was nearly outlawed and destroyed because of it. So I'd say that that's a pretty negative interaction right there. The second example I'm going to give you is cinchona trees. They also grow not in the mountains, but in the rainforest on the side of the mountains. So it's kind of like the same region up there. So they're one of the most common trees in the Amazon rainforest, and they're super common in Peru. And they're really important in Peru. They're on the country's flag. There's a lot of significance there. But the bark was long used to treat like fevers and pain by native groups before the Spanish even arrived. So malaria didn't exist in the Americas before the Spanish showed up, but so the indigenous people didn't really discover that the tree was a cure for malaria until like around the 1600s. So there's this legend that there was this man who was sick, like really, really sick, and he was lost in the cloud forest, which is this forest along the mountains. And he was sick, he was dying, he drank from a pool on the ground, it tasted really bitter, and he was like, oh crap, that's poison. He thought he was just going to die right then and there, but in an hour or so his like fever completely broke. So he realized that there were a bunch of cinchona trees around the pool, and he was like, oh, like whatever's in them has been infused into this water, and it cured me. So he went back to his village and he told everyone about it, and word of mouth kind of spread this, and people began using cinchona tree bark as a cure to treat malaria fevers. That's just a legend, but I like it. I think it's cool, and yeah. So here we have a photo of some red blood cells that have been infected by a malaria parasite. And the way that malaria works is it gets into your bloodstream and it affects all your red blood cells until they're no longer affected and you die. So quinine attacks the malarial parasite when it's inside of your bloodstream, and in some strains of malaria, it also destroys the parasite's gametes. It's not entirely clear how quinine, which is the active component to the cinchona tree, it's not really clear how it works, but it's really effective. It kills cures more than 98% of cases of malaria that are uncomplicated. So the discovery of cinchona trees as a cure for malaria saved countless lives and will continue to save countless more. It's still being used as a treatment. Really important medicinal discovery right there. So once the Spanish learned that cinchona trees could cure malaria, they shared the cure with others in Europe. So initially the South American governments tried to really monopolize this industry and cultivation of cinchona trees. The Dutch eventually stole seeds from South America and started an industry in Java, which is an island, and eventually began to control 95% of the industry. So before the 1820s, the bark was like kind of ground up and put into water, which was then like drinking. But in the 1820s, two French scientists were able to extract the quinine from the bark, and malaria medication began to be synthesized artificially. So in this example, medicinal knowledge is really passed between cultures, which I think is a really good thing. But this drug was taken against direct orders from the South American government, and it was grown in plantations in Java. This took away economic potential from the indigenous groups living in the Amazon, and also destroyed habitats in other parts of the world. I think it was a pretty gross abuse of power, and therefore I would say that that part of this interaction was quite negative. So my third example is the noni fruit, which is used throughout Southeast Asia and the Pacific, like Oceania. But in my research, I was focusing mainly on Hawaii, so I focused mainly on its cultural use there. So noni is a canoe plant. So when the Polynesian travelers would go from island to island in their canoes, they would bring only the most important plants with them, a group of around like 25 different plants. So the plant has like 3 different varieties, 2 of which are used medicinally. And in Hawaii, these medicine men, which they call kahuna, selected plants that smelled bad or tasted bad, and they believed that like that drove away negative entities. That's what they use for like medicinal treatments. So noni is like particularly foul. It's used quite often because of that. So in Hawaii, the juice from the fruit was kind of turned into a cream and then applied to like wounds or like muscle injuries as like kind of like pain relief. And in Southeast Asia, in addition to using it for pain relief, they also use it to cure like, respiratory illnesses. So in the 1950s, there was this man named Ralph Henneke, who was in Hawaii. He was working for the Dole Pineapple Company as a biochemist. So he became really fascinated by noni, and he decided that he was going to spend a good amount of his time trying to figure out how it worked and then make a profit off of it. And he really did, because noni was high in proxyrenine. So basically, when an enzyme called proxyrenase comes into contact with this molecule called proxyrenine and another molecule called serotonin, which is not serotonin, it catalyzes this reaction, which then forms this molecule called serine. And serine is really essential for a lot of different proteins to function. It's also potentially capable of fixing ineffective proteins or proteins that have folded wrong, and it's also maybe okay at like, regulating protein folding, but it's all really unclear. So there's a lot of evidence that it's a really strong, powerful compound, and it's probably doing really important things in our cells. But there's no like concrete proof of its effectiveness because more research needs to be done on how this protein regulation is actually happening and how that's actually helping with like pain relief and like wound healing and providing any type of like medicinal relief. So when Ralph Henneke decided to market his discovery, he chose to like band together with people who would market it as kind of a fad product. So it's become a product that's like widely sold on like Amazon. You can find it in Costco if you look hard enough. And it's sold for a really high price, and it promises kind of like a cure to every sort of ailment under the sun. So Hawaiians were able to like differentiate between the variations in noni, and they were used to treat like different types of pain. But this leads scientists to believe that like, each variation of noni has a slightly different compound, which is something we also still don't completely understand. So the commercialized version of this plant pays pretty much no mind to those nuances and just kind of combines them all together to form their product, which probably affects the overall functionality of these products entirely. So there are studies that suggest that noni might potentially be good for healing chronic conditions such as cardiovascular disease and diabetes, but people are really hesitant to study these possibilities. So the misleading advertising around this product has turned this like pharmacologically active plant into kind of a hoax. And many scientists don't really want to touch it for fear of looking like crackpots. And additionally, once something has been turned into a hoax, it's really difficult to get funding for research. So even if somebody did want to study this plant, there's just too many roadblocks in their way for them to do so. So this plant has really become a fad. The traditional uses of this plant have been completely undermined, which undermine the medicinal potential of this fruit, and also it's kind of disrespectful to Polynesian culture and like the reality and like the effectiveness of the things that they're actually using. And I'd say that like this interaction really strays from the path of like respect and like thoughtfulness that Schultes kind of left us to follow. Alright, so this is the last example of a negative interaction. So in the Amazon River Basin, there's this concept among local people that like plants can teach us things. And this most often refers to the visions caused by hallucinogens. So ayahuasca has been a part of Amazon culture for thousands of years, and the ritual that comes along with it is just as sacred. The ceremony kind of begins when this tea brewed from these two plants is consumed, and there's a lot of significance placed on this moment. It tastes really bad, and that's considered like the first step towards like self-healing, like this whole journey towards self-healing, really. So the second phase begins when like people start to feel a little bit dizzy. There's some distortion in reality begins to occur, and it's kind of like as if someone were drunk. The third phase begins about an hour and a half later, where and that part includes like really vivid visions, and that's what ayahuasca is really famous for. It's also accompanied by a lot of like vomiting, diarrhea, and this is actually considered therapeutic cleansing because it's like ridding the body of toxins and like helping one like kind of like purge themselves of everything they're trying to like move forward from. So at the end of the ceremony, like the shaman will kind of blow smoke over the person, put some cologne on their temples, on their like hands too, and then the person will symbolically end the ceremony by like eating just a little bit of salt. And then after, once they feel better from all the like gastrointestinal stuff, they'll like, eat a full meal. But then they'll remain in the rainforest with the shaman for like a few days afterwards, because there's often some side effects, including like some of the stuff we saw with mushrooms earlier with the panic attacks and nightmares, or like just more illness. So ayahuasca isn't really a traditional drug. It doesn't really cure you of any disease or like rid you of anything, but it causes these really introspective, dreamlike visions that are really deeply connected to your own emotional and physical memories. So it opens up one one to like a part of themselves that they wouldn't normally have access to, which allows them to gain like insights into themselves and their own past psychological traumas and help them process their old memories in a new way. So following ayahuasca ceremonies, many people report like long-term increases in happiness, confidence, inner peace. And traditionally, like a shaman will guide you along this journey and kind of like steer you, which is really crucial because one's mindset before drinking the tea and their surroundings during the ceremony really determines the experience that they're going to have. So ayahuasca is brewed from two separate plants, the Brainestoropis caffi, which is known as the vision vine, and Psychotropic viridis. So the effect of ayahuasca stems from a combination of a molecule that inhibits the monoamine oxide enzyme, which we're going to call that compound an MAOI because that's a mouthful, and N,N-dimethyltryptamine, which is also a mouthful. So N,N-dimethyltryptamine is a compound that's like really similar to serotonin, which is the neurotransmitter that's like responsible for sending signals of like happiness and well-being. So this N,N-dimethyltryptamine is able to kind of like pass the serotonin in the brain. So it'll bind to serotonin receptors and activate them continuously. It'll kind of get stuck in there. And then the MAOIs inhibit the enzyme that's responsible for kind of breaking down loose serotonin that's floating around. So what you get is like a bunch of fake serotonin that's getting stuck in the serotonin receptors and then no way to really get rid of it. So this N,N-dimethyltryptamine is able to enter the central nervous system and really stay there for a long time, which causes these hallucinations that last a really long time and become really extreme. So recent studies have shown that ayahuasca is capable of helping those with like some really serious psychological conditions. So these experiments have shown that ayahuasca rituals reduce depression by 79% initially, and then 66, and then the symptoms 2 weeks later are still 66% below baseline. And you can see there's also significant reductions in the amount of stress one feels, and less significant, but still significant reductions in the amount of anxiety one feels. So there's also another study done in Peru that shows that young people who participate in ayahuasca rituals are overall less stressed, more self-confident, and more emotionally mature than their peers, and that this like hallucinogenic ritual can cause long-term improvements in like thinking and mindfulness. So ayahuasca ceremonies have been happening for a really long time, but recently its tea and curative properties have become kind of known and popular throughout Western culture. So like in the old days when people would go on vacation, they go to like Paris or Rome or other like cosmopolitan cities. But now people with like the money to travel are looking for more like exotic experiences, and ayahuasca rituals kind of fall into that bucket of exoticism. So because of that, a lot of rituals have been like changed and piloted for tourists. And so they've like created like a bunch of companies have basically created inauthentic ceremonies piloted specifically for like Western people. And these sometimes include like bonfires, nudity, drums, and just other symbols of that Americans have of exoticism. And it's not just like a small thing that like a few people are taking part of. This is like a huge industry. Almost 1/3 of the Amazon's ayahuasca is growing for this purpose. And so there's clearly an increase in happiness and inner peace that one can gain from an ayahuasca ritual, but without the traditional method and without proper guidance, you can't learn effectively from like the quote-unquote mother of all plants. So proper setting for these rituals is really important because settings are important for all hallucinogenics. Wade Davis, who was a student of Dr. Schultes, who we mentioned earlier, wrote in his book that if you're like walking through the forest and you stumble on psychedelic mushrooms and accidentally eat them, you're going to wind up in the hospital, you're going to be hysterical, you're going to have a really awful time. But if you take them intentionally, there's a much better chance that your experience is going to be positive. So with these commercial ceremonies, the risk of like bad trips are just much higher. And also the full effects of the ceremony just can't be experienced because without parts of the ritual like the fasting and the days of reflection afterwards in the forest, the deep level of introspective thought and reflection that ayahuasca is supposed to provide people just like can't be reached. So those performing the ceremonies are also not trained to do so. They're not members of indigenous groups who like partaken in these ceremonies. They're people who are like in the tourism industry. And these companies have really driven up the cost of ayahuasca and made it really hard to find, so that people in the Amazon are having a lot of difficulty affording it. So they're capitalizing on something spiritual, and this capitalization has caused a lot of cultural loss and created a lot of difficulty for people to like participate in the ritual. It's like really like a crux of their culture. So just to like quickly recap, because that was a lot. Cocaine is an example of Western culture taking something, changing it, abusing it, stigmatizing it. Cinchona trees is an example of something kind of like a medicine coming across cultures and then being kind of taken advantage of economically. Noni juice is an example of something being hoaxified, kind of turned into a fad. And ayahuasca is an example of like capitalizing on something spiritual and how that can lead to cultural loss. So you might be wondering if like there's ever been an interaction between like Western culture and like traditional medicine that's been positive. And in all the research that I did, there was one example that did stand out. It's not perfect, but the study of this plant has definitely remained truer to Dr. Schultes' legacy. So kava is another shrub from the South Pacific, and it grows on most Polynesian islands. It was brought from Manus Island with Polynesian travelers, and it's pretty much used all over. So there are some islands that don't use it, but pretty much every Polynesian culture has a different variation of kava that they use and a different ritual they use to like consume it. So these ceremonies are really different, but there are commonalities, including the settings in which kava is consumed. It's usually a large social gathering, and then a chief-like figure will start to brew the tea, and people consume the collagen and like continue to socialize. So there are different variations of kava across the South Pacific that vary in like potency and the type of effect that the plant has. So most variations of kava are used as a calmative, and occasionally they're used to help people fall into a hypnosis or a hallucinogenic state. But the narcotic effects are often exaggerated. Hallucinations are really uncommon, and their effects are usually just like, the effect of kava is usually just like calming, relaxing. But there are certain variations of the plant that are known to cause hallucinations, but they're really rare. Schultes didn't even consider this plant a hallucinogen. He called it a hypnotic instead. So scientists have determined that the active ingredient in kava is kavacones, but it's unclear how they reduce anxiety. So there are 18 different types of kavacones that have been discovered. This is a few of them. So when kava is consumed, these compounds are absorbed into the brain, and specifically the part of the brain that's responsible for hormone function and the autonomic nervous system. So this is a picture of another neuron, and basically what happens in a neuron is this is the part of the cell that receives the signal, and then it'll send it along this axon into the part of the cell that will then transmit it to the next neuron. So along here, there are these things called sodium ion channels, which are responsible for bringing particles into this part of the cell that will then like send a signal to the like end place. So kavacones likely block these sodium ion channels, which then reduce the speed at which a signal can be sent down the axon, and which then reduces the amount of signals being sent in the brain and produces an overall really calming effect. So kava has been proven a really effective treatment for anxiety disorders. With kava, there's a low risk of dependency on the treatment, and in an Australian experiment done in 2007, 26% of subjects with general anxiety disorder who were given kava were in remission with their anxiety at the end of the 8-week study, whereas only 6% of the placebo group were. So kava has become somewhat popular in the United States, and it's legal for personal use. There's almost 100 bars across the country that like sell the beverage, which is not a lot, but yeah. The key benefit from drinking kava is still its ability to kind of calm you, relax you without like inhibiting your mental clarity in any kind of way. So I think that this situation was a positive example because kava was researched, it was taken seriously, it wasn't stigmatized, it was used responsibly. No rituals were being capitalized upon. For example, like if you go to Hawaii or like any other Polynesian island, the people there still have access to the plant. They're able to do whatever ceremonies they used to do beforehand, and that hasn't really been infringed upon with these kava bars. But it's also like not perfect because kava has many variations. There's differences in potency across islands, and we're not really super aware of these nuances. We also aren't really exporting, like kava isn't really being exported, it's growing in Hawaii, so our consumption of kava in the US mainland is coming from Hawaii, and that might be taking economic potential away from other countries. But it's not perfect, but it's the best example we have, and it should be regarded as a less problematic approach for future situations with like interactions between Western culture and indigenous people. So all 5 of these examples show different ways in which Western culture has adopted different traditional medicines. So most of these examples were negative, but as we saw with Kappa, there's potential for these interactions to be more positive. So the incorporation of plant-based medicine into our culture isn't something that doesn't really happen. It's not something that hippies were doing in the 70s, but it's something we're actually seeing a lot of because there's the legalization of marijuana, that's a plant-based medicine being brought into our culture. And most recently, there's the decriminalization of psychedelic mushrooms in Denver. So I think that we're watching a societal shift away from the stigmatization of plant-based drugs and towards the incorporation of them both medically and recreationally. So I think that with this situation, we should see if we can do better than we've done in the past. So weed has been destigmatized in a lot of ways and is now gaining respect among the American medical community for its effectiveness. And I'm relatively confident that we're about to see the same shift with psychedelic mushrooms. Magic mushrooms and other plant-based treatments are gaining popularity, and it's really important to learn from our past successes and failures. So we shouldn't be robbing indigenous cultures of their rituals or their economic opportunities. We should be studying these plants' pharmacological properties and using them in the way that they're intended. So I'm just going to leave you with plants have medicinal properties that are significant. Traditional medicine should be respected and explored, and indigenous cultures and their rituals should also be respected. Thank you. Yeah.
Which one was your favorite?
Ayahuasca.
Yeah.
Just because I really like the art that comes with it too. So reading all my slides is really cool. I also found it to be the most interesting. Just like with there's a really large cultural piece, and I was able to just find the most on it, which is really cool. Yeah. I don't know. If there's other questions, we're good.
We gotta give like 30 seconds.
Okay.
Is the art part of the traditional reflection in the forest, or is that something that usually comes along?
I don't think it's part of the traditional ceremony, but there is a lot of Instagram pages just dedicated to psychedelic artwork, which if I go back a few slides, I think you saw the yellow pictures of just the things that come out of people after they've been influenced by psychedelics are just really cool pieces of art.
Do you think that the use of these different plants in Western culture would be more effective if the traditions themselves carry over, or if the the active ingredients like with cocaine was identified and taken out and then synthesized?
I think it really depends, because with quinine, there's no need for any type of ritual. You can just take it and use it as an antimalarial, as a pill. But with things like hallucinogens, because the way in which the hallucinations take place isn't really all that controllable. The ritual is there for a reason. The ritual is there so that you can control the hallucinations, so that they're more beneficial instead of harmful, because they can be harmful really quickly and really easily. So I think in those instances, it's important maybe not to appropriate the rituals, but to incorporate the core parts of the rituals and the things that are really important in the rituals for guiding someone through a positive experience. I don't know if that answers it.
Where do we find these people?
Which people?
The shamans? You guys?
I